I wanted to talk a little bit today about successful application modernization, and I'm not going to talk a ton about ChatGPT, but I probably can talk a little bit about it, as well as we're thinking about things like Copilot, code generation, etc. But I wanted to talk through the fundamentals of like, why are we doing this? Why are some of the things that we should think about? And then why is app modernization and innovation I'll use the terms kind of interchangeably as we go through this, but why are they important to us as we think about how we're going to evolve within the organization, take advantage of new technology? So we'll talk about what are some of the phases that we might think about during app modernization. What are some of the common mistakes we should avoid? How do we realize value from app innovation? Because like all things, it costs money to do this. So are we doing it for the right reasons? Are we doing it so that we can enable ourselves to be more effective in the future and also to take advantage of our application estate, our the great strategies that we have related to how we approach the market? So those are things that are really important to us. And then, of course, just talk about how we can help. So if we look at digital transformation within organizations, and this is really sort of at a high level to set the stage a little bit, organizations are trying to, especially with the economy, under a little bit of stress these days, trying to figure out ways to become more digital. How do we take advantage of our existing capabilities? How do we do more with less? And digital transformation is a key part of that. So it's a really important category for organizations to think about. And this question right at the bottom, what will it take to thrive? And so in a lot of ways, we'll be talking about application modernization's role in all of this. One of the key considerations as we think through this is technical debt. So many of us are or have an existing application estate where we do have technical debt. We have either aging application infrastructure, maybe aging applications, maybe even third-party applications, or we actually went down the path of, small companies start off and they start with applications that were prototypes that now turned into production level systems. So in some ways we cut corners a little bit as we move forward. So this is a big deal. And when we talk to customers and when we do analysis, we can see that technical debt is a big concern for a lot of organizations. And there are many reasons why technical debt is a concern. And I'll talk about how we can address some of them. Some of it could be related to we don't even have the resources to start. We don't have the budget. We can't disrupt the entire organization in terms of user experience, customer experience, employee experience, because it takes too much from an organizational change perspective to be able to adopt a new technique or technology. So those are things that you should take into consideration as we think about this overall. The other characteristic of this is optimization. So when we look at a survey that we performed, we can see that enterprises are really interested in prioritizing optimization. So as I was talking about before, entering into this digital transformation mode, especially with the economy, but I think in general, most organizations want to be more fiscally responsible, but also have the ability to make additional profit. So clearly it's an important characteristic. So looking right here, the number one when we talk about here is data and application initiatives. And so it's related to application optimization, creating applications that directly address the needs of our consumers or our internal customers, employees, business folks, so that we can accomplish what we need to in terms of realizing the benefits for the business. And so these numbers are pretty good when you think about, just percentage-wise, optimizing data and analytics capabilities, for example, 51%. But guess what? Supports that application infrastructure needs to support all of those analytical capabilities. So data-driven applications is a fundamental principle that we want to make sure that we think about as we sort of get into some of the way that we think about our application estate. So let's talk about application modernization, best practices, strategies that we would employ in order to be able to take advantage of not only the interest, but also the momentum swing as you think about where we're going across the market. So most organizations, when they look at it, they would they think about this in terms of size of the application estate and what they need to do. And in the backdrop of all of this is the whole concept of technical debt. So on average, an enterprise would have over 300, close to 400 custom applications that they deploy, but only 45% of them regularly used, meaning that the analysis of that application estate in terms of optimization, you want to also understand, well, what do you use and why do you use it? And do you want to continue to manage and maintain it? So in some ways, you can kind of do you can do more with less, or you can reduce the size of your application estate by really understanding what applications maybe you no longer need that you could retire potentially. So that's one way to look at it. And we'll get into that in a minute. Or you could look at legacy systems. They can cost an organization up to 15%. So upgrades. So you can now look at are there new, more advanced systems that maybe SaaS systems that you no longer need to, say, license or deploy internally, that might allow you to be able to take advantage of some of these inefficiencies that exist within legacy systems or legacy applications. And then 87% of IT executives looking at modernization of critical applications so that they can realize their digital transformation goals. So really important characteristics. So that really sort of sets the stage for us to talk a little bit about, well, what are some of the concerns that we would have? Cost is one, of course. You can't find developers or folks that really understand new technologies, whether it's Kubernetes or other kinds of platform or even cloud-based application environments, or even understanding how we can use software as a service applications or platform as a service applications and integrate with them effectively so that we can streamline our ability to create modern applications that really represent what our business is looking to achieve. And of course, there still are things like retiring legacy platforms, mainframes. Yes, there still are mainframes out there that people still use. So those are things that we want to make sure that we understand what some of the concerns are and then how to address them, which I'll get to in a minute. Unsupported technology, a big one, difficult to integrate with modern systems. Integration is kind of a big deal these days, although a lot of new applications are service-based, API-based, so we have the ability to interact usually through APIs or software services, but not all of them are. So sometimes it's difficult to integrate. So these are things that we want to take into consideration. This whole movement toward creating services-based applications is really important. Microservices, even more important as we think about the future. And then poor user experience and usability is always critical, because some of the technical debt that I was talking about before, or even when I was talking about applications that are no longer used well, why don't people use them? It may be the poor user experience, or maybe difficult to use, or maybe they don't even accomplish the needs that most users are looking for. So these are really critical to us as we think about it. So whether we have a single app or a handful of apps, we want to make sure that we have a good approach and really look at it from the perspective of it's a journey. We're trying to create a culture of application modernization or innovation within our application environment. It's not just a one and done. So when we think about how do we look at our estate, how do we understand what we want to achieve, not only in the next 30, 60, 90 days, but also into the future, the next 3 to 5 years. So it can really serve as a catalyst to transform the business or the culture, the technical culture of your organization. So developers get really excited when we start thinking about, well, we're going to start taking advantage of things like Kubernetes and microservices or software as a service platforms in order to allow us to be able to do things more effectively, or frameworks that allow us to be able to enable these new technology capabilities, or using Copilot, for example, to help us code better with GitHub, or other kinds of productivity enhancing capabilities for our development teams, so that we can actually do more, we can accomplish more, and then move on to more impactful kinds of applications that will allow us to be able to perform or maximize the digital transformation within our organization. So that's really the important part of what we think about as we go through this process. Now, I won't get a ton into the alignment to business goals, but it has to be there. There's really no way for us to fund the kind of cool technology modernization or innovation programs that we look at unless there's business value. And so I always talk about this. And if you've ever heard me talk in any topic area, I really just focus on we need to understand the business perspective. What is the value we're going to get? It's really an ROI discussion at the end of the day. And even when I talk to my students about understanding cloud architectures and creating architecture, well, that also is based off of it's a cost benefit analysis. You have to understand what type of architecture do we need and how are we going to support it. Everything from the performance of the service all the way through to the organizational impact or even the maintenance and management of the environment that you would create. So all of those things do come into play as you think about overall, what is your approach? The business goals are really critical to that. And certainly identifying what they are and then having a good perspective on what it would take in order to realize those business goals is what this is all about. So the strategy that we'll really be going through is to look through our application estate and really just understand how would we categorize what it is that we would want to do in terms of realizing business benefit. And in some ways, we can talk about expected outcome for, or the destination, if you will, for all of the applications within our application estate as part of doing an assessment of what we have. But it's also sort of bucketizing the impact levels. So this is another key criteria in terms of really understanding what is the expected outcome. Cost will play into all of this, and cost from the perspective of maybe resource costs, could be dollar costs, or it could be maybe reputational costs, which are associated with the business. So, for example, if refactoring is one of the key areas where we think about in terms of outcomes. So if we're going to refactor an application, we may be refactoring the application because it may provide additional or better user experience for our end consumers, or maybe it's going to be refactored because it's going to save us money. Maybe it's going to be more effective. It can run on a lighter weight platform, or maybe we can streamline the application so that it can actually take advantage of microservices or shared services, which allow us to be able to do this more effectively. So refactoring can, for example, be a great use case for helping us to align to the overall business strategy. And so when we go through the application estate and we talk to you about how is it that we would sort of determine the expected outcome, these are the kinds of criteria that we would use in order to help you to understand what it is that you need to do. So once we sort of gotten through this categorization, if you will, now we can actually really get real about what is it that we're going to do with these. And usually the distribution that we would see is somewhere in the neighborhood of these percentages that I provided here. This is not specific to all organizations, but in general, you would see probably close to half of them being rehosted, refactored, or re-architected, because in most cases, you are using a good percentage of your current applications. They may not be addressing the specific business goals or needs. So you're going to want to think about what are some of the things that you would do to change that. And we also want to take into consideration what is the value impact at the end of the day. So this is sort of how we see the distribution factoring out. And you would probably see this as well when you go through this exercise, really just understanding how it is you're going to address the concerns that you would have in your existing application estate, or even looking at maybe new applications that might address gaps that you might have identified. But the important thing to note here is that there's a good percentage you would probably retire. So the stats that I was talking about in the beginning are critical, because you do want to look at the applications that are underused, maybe not used at all. And then what were they doing? And maybe they should have been following sort of a logical application lifecycle where you said these applications serve their purpose. They no longer are serving a purpose. We should really think about retiring them instead of just letting them exist, on and on, which adds to your overall cost. And honestly, they also add to your technical debt. So those, you shouldn't be afraid to retire applications and really just understand what it takes to do that as well. Now, one of the things that I talked about was also, it's great. You might go through 345 applications, was what I talked about earlier in terms of the total numbers or average numbers that people would have within their custom application estate. So you may look at that and say 345 applications, that's a lot of stuff to move. So you don't want to do a monolithic data movement, for example, or application movement, sorry. You want to think about this in an agile way. You want to think about it as a learning experience and evolution. So we recommend the process of going, taking a small subset, picking, and pictorially, we're sort of indicating this, pick some of the different buckets of categories that we've described. Maybe some you're retiring, some you're rehosting or re-architecting, maybe you're refactoring or other. So pick a few where you want to gain some exposure. And also you want to be able to understand what are some of the risks or how do you mitigate some of the risks that you might have identified when you were thinking about the approach. And this gives you the ability to learn. And so that's what we always recommend first. You take a few applications, you run them through the process, you learn as you go, and then you adjust. So before you get into the next wave or next several waves, you are starting to then refactor your process overall, and then to learn more as you go, and you become much more operationally efficient. In a lot of ways, so customers sometimes work with us to go through this process, and we help teach them how to go through the process so that by the time you get to the later waves, we don't really need to be involved anymore. It's part of the transformation of the IT groups and IT teams that are actually managing these applications into the future. So one of the things that I talked about earlier as well was a cultural transformation within the IT organization. So as I said before, it's not just that we're trying to go through the modernization of all the applications and then would be done with it. It's more, how do you infuse this kind of strategy into the IT team? Because as new technologies come along, as new capabilities are introduced, you want to make sure that the organization is able to take advantage of those innovations. And as part of this process, the secondary benefit is not just moving those applications and providing business value, but it's also allowing you to be able to say culturally, now my organization does understand how to do this on our own, so that when new technology is introduced, we can do the ROI on our own. We know exactly what the benefit's going to be for us. We know whether or not we should, say, adopt a new capability as part of providing value to our business, especially as it might relate, for example, to things like competitive advantage, et cetera. So that's a really important characteristic of this. The plan is critical, and this is a joint operation with the customer to be able to understand what it is that you want to do. This is far from being just an offshore team's going to migrate all your applications for you. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about really understanding the true value and ROI of going through these processes and then realizing significant business value. So once we actually get into the execution phase, then there's really just a pre-described or predefined framework, which allows us to be able to execute the steps. Now, this is still high level, and when we get into the details, we get into low levels of detail. But in general, you get the idea. So you have to have sort of a prescribed way and a disciplined approach to be able to understand the disposition of each of those applications based on the buckets that we described. So for example, if I'm doing a retirement, then I identify the users that might be impacted. I would communicate the end of life dates. I'd shut down the servers, and then we'd move forward. And communication of end of life date, for example, may include, maybe there's some training that's associated with it. So we would factor that in. Maybe through retirement, those users would need to use a different application. We can talk about that and help you to understand what some of the value is there. So use different applications, use different tools. And then re-architecting, for example, a little bit more complex. You can notice here we've got this feedback loop embedded. So align and redesign the architecture, prep a landing zone, for example, if we move it into the cloud, develop unit tests, automate CI/CD pipelines, including security and best practices, systems testing, deploy and replace, et cetera, and then iterate, learn and iterate. So re-architecting requires us to be able to factor in new technology, new capabilities, and then perform the testing that's required in order to ensure that it provides similar capabilities to what it was provided before, versus something like a refactor, where we're actually just looking at, how are we going to change the functional capabilities and then be able to test those, or a re-envisioning where we say these applications aren't really accomplishing what we expect them to. So now we're going to go through the process of actually completely redesigning them through a re-envisioning phase, which is true. It's a small percent of the application typically estate, but that's what we usually want to make sure that we do, because in order to either ensure competitive advantage or to be able to keep up with your competitors, you really do need to think about sort of re-envisioning your mission critical applications that really drive your business forward. So those are important to us. Okay, so the other part is, of course, operationalization, training and adoption, and then continuing to innovate. As I mentioned before, these are really part of or germane to the overall process. As I said, you don't just push a button and everything moves and everybody's happy, although maybe with ChatGPT in the future you can do that. I'm just kidding. I doubt we're going to get there for quite some time. But operationalization is critical, making sure we understand what it is that we need to do and any guides that we would require. Training and adoption is also not only for the technical teams, but also for the users that can be impacted from the movement of the estate or the modernization of the estate, or even innovations that would occur as part of the process. And then establishing that culture of innovation. So allowing us to be able to continue to learn and innovate as we think about the overall modernization process within the organization. Now, there's some misconceptions, of course, that we might have along the way. So make sure that you have a strategy. Modernization is not just porting. I already mentioned this several times. So just make sure that that one sort of rings true with you. You look at it and say, this is not a one and done. This is really how do we embrace this concept of ensuring that we continue to refresh our application estate and make sure that we are keeping up with the latest technology and trends and understanding the value that they can provide. Thinking strategically is another one. So it's basically make sure that we understand the expected outcome and start small. We may not be able to boil the ocean, but we know where we want to go. So we can act tactically. You can follow the framework that I described in order to be successful. And the other thing is that when we're starting, it's okay to learn in the beginning. There will be failures. Failure is okay. Understanding exactly what it is that we're learning through the process. So because we're not taking this, boil the ocean approach, we're able to do small test cases. We're able to learn as we go, and then we can make small modifications, and then eventually we will get really good at it, and then we can take on the rest of the application estate so that we can do it in a more factory-like approach, where we can then say take existing applications that we're looking to refactor or re-architect, and then go through the process more effectively, and then scale the process as we go. So it doesn't need to be as slow. It shouldn't take you years, but in the beginning, it takes a little bit longer because you're learning. And so that's really important. So really afford yourself the time in the beginning to really learn once you understand the actual approach. And then I talked a lot about sort of this concept of application innovation. So what does it really mean to take advantage of application innovation? So I like to talk about it in the context of this sort of value and asset creation and realization, because in essence, what we're doing is we're looking at our applications and our application estate, and we're really understanding how do we align this to the stakeholder priorities. How do we really understand some of the characteristics that might be associated with application innovation approaches or modernization approaches? And then what are some of the enablers that we might put in place? Some of them we've already talked about. So it could be our application or modernization and innovation strategy. It might be the way we organize our portfolio, for example. So you should be thinking about what are some of those characteristics. And then on the value realization side is when you actually do create the innovative application or a new application which allows you to be able to realize business value, is really just understanding and measuring what is the stakeholder impact. Can you measure that impact, whether it's effectively just looking at growth of the business, or adoption or optimization within the context of your overall business model. And then the benefits to the organization and to the end user is really one that I like to focus on, because this is where you can actually measure the expected outcomes. So we might have gone through this entire framework, but how do we know whether or not we had an impact? Well, if the target audience is the customer, we can do things like measuring customer experience or CPEs. We can also look at, are we doing better? Do we have a higher valuation? Are we doing better in the market? Other impact levels that we can measure. Another big one is certainly compliance. So if we think about compliance, do we conform to regulatory compliance measures that are being put in place as we think about overall value? If that's one of the measures of business success within a regulated environment, for example, finance or healthcare, et cetera. So this is another good approach that allows you to be able to sort of understand, what are the investments I'm making? How am I impacting my stakeholders? And then how am I measuring that impact overall? Because as I said before, we can talk about modernization from a technical perspective, but there's so much more to it than that, because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing, we're identifying the right opportunities, we're making the investments where we really want to, and that's really most significant for us as we go. So I think I'm just about at time. Wow, that was almost perfect. So just kind of, if there are any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them as we go. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Danielle, and we can continue forward, but I'd love to answer any questions if you have any.